China has threatened legal actions through its very own anti-sanction laws against the U.S. and its export controls on Huawei Ascend series of chips. Let's go ahead and jump right now into the story. If you're familiar with the channel, then you know we have been covering this detail by detail over the past week. Beijing says it will invoke its anti-sanctions laws against any individual or organization that adheres to a recent U.S. warning against Huawei's Ascend chips. This warning was sloppily written by Washington. Last week, I compared it to a live editing of a Word document by students on the BIS.gov website. They had multiple versions that went live. This is how unprofessional they were. They didn't even finalize it. They just typed something, put it up. We're like, no, we changed our mind, type that, put it up. And then they came to a final version. In this final version, they are threatening substantial criminal penalties as well as civil penalties against anybody who uses the Huawei Ascend series line of chips. And the U.S. says repeatedly in this document that they believe these chips are likely made with stolen components, stolen technology from TSMC or Nvidia. However, the term likely does not mean that they are. The U.S. has provided no proof as to date, and it appears that Beijing has had enough of this. A day after accusing the United States of undermining their trade truce, which is what I think is going on, they came back from Switzerland, Vicente, and the Chinese, and it sounded like they had a good trade meeting from both sides, and then all of a sudden the U.S. does this. Why? China has now threatened legal actions against anyone who shuns its chips because of a recent advisory notice by Washington. The advisory issued last week said that the use of Chinese chips, especially the Ascend AI processors made by U.S.-sanctioned Huawei, would amount to a violation of Washington's export controls. This is true. It wasn't just the Ascend series. The Ascend series was explicitly listed, but it did say that anything else that they believe violated this part of the export law. On Wednesday, Beijing said it would take legal action against any individual or organization assisting or acting on this U.S. warning. In a statement, China's Commerce Ministry said the U.S. should abide by international economic and trade rules and respect other countries' rights to scientific and technological development. It said the U.S. had abused export controls to suppress China, which is a violation of international laws and principles of international relationships. In a statement, the ministry also said there could be corresponding legal liabilities against those involved in implementing the U.S. advisory note, which it said would constitute discriminatory restrictive measures against Chinese firms. Absolutely it would. Think about any Chinese firm that was to go out and buy a Huawei Cloud Matrix 384. Those people that work there now, all the executives, the CTO, all the developers that work with this server would now, if they ever left the country, they would have to fear that some U.S. puppet like Canada would arrest them like they did to Meng. And they'd arrest them unjustly. Look at Meng's case of what happened to her when she violated U.S. sanctions against Iran. Canada didn't have sanctions against Iran. U.S. did. So you would think under the rule for extradition, the extradition treaty that Canada has with the U.S., there has to be a litmus test called double criminality. You would say, well, she's free. Canada doesn't have such a law. It's a made-up law in the U.S. But no, the Canadian government did everything they could to find her guilty of this crime. And so the point I'm trying to make here is this is really restrictive against Chinese firms because they're the only ones that are in the market for this right now. Huawei doesn't have enough supply as it is right now to satiate the demand in China for these type of AI servers. So Huawei isn't competing yet on the global stage because right now they just have to build up the supply just to meet the demand in China. And the U.S. is saying, they're saying to Chinese firms, they're telling Chinese firms that they can't use these chips. Is this respecting the sovereignty of another nation? You're telling Chinese firms that they cannot use Chinese chips. And that if they do, if they come over to our soil, ours being anybody under the thumb of the U.S., they're going to face substantial criminal penalties as well as civil penalties. This is just this is a circus, right? And the only adult in the room has to respond. So according to a report by the South China Morning Post, the ministry also said it would invoke this anti-sanctions law against any entity involved in implementing those sanctions. Passed in 2021, anti-foreign sanctions law says that individuals or entities involved in making or implementing discriminatory measures against Chinese citizens or entities could be put on an anti-sanctions list by a relevant department in Chinese government. This bothers me so much. There wouldn't have to be this law made by China. This is a retaliation. This is something they felt like they were forced to do, to make this law. You think that they made this law up on their own? No, they did this because of the case with Meng. They did this because of the Huawei sanctions and the sanctions that were put on Xiaomi, which later got dropped. That's why they passed this law. It's the only reason it's there. And so it's like this stuff doesn't have to happen. And again, I'm not blaming China. I'm blaming us because we're sitting here and we're weaponizing the dollar. Instead of enjoying it as the world currency, the United States is weaponizing it, which I don't think is the best thing to do, just personally. I would think it's better to work together, mutually beneficial cooperation with other nations around the world, instead of always looking to punish them with the SWIFT system. Anyways, those on the list may be denied entry into China or be expelled from the country. Their assets within China may be seized or frozen, and they could also be restricted from doing business with entities or people within China. Tit for tat, the law also says that any such entity on the list would also be liable to pay compensation to China for the losses it incurs from sanctions. China implemented the law to resist pressure at the time from the U.S. over trade technology. Hong Kong and Beijing, sorry if I got that wrong, I didn't look that up prior. Its friction with the U.S. has only worsened since. In the most wide-ranging legal tool Beijing has introduced in recent years to retaliate against foreign sanctions, experts said it is intended to give Chinese retaliatory measures more legitimacy and predictability. Speaking to the SCMP, one Beijing-aligned expert said that China's threat was in line with the nature of the U.S. advisory note last week. Absolutely, it's in line. Absolutely. This is the U.S. note from the Bureau of Industry and Security. This guidance alerts industry to the risk of using PRC advanced computing ICs, including specific Huawei Ascend chips. These chips were likely, they're not providing proof, developed or produced in violation of U.S. export controls. I think at a minimum that you should prove this, and they should be able to prove this. This is the U.S. government. It's not like they don't have the resources to go out and prove this. It's not like they can't get their hands on one of these Huawei Ascend chips and then immediately go to Jensen or to TSMC to find conclusive proof, right? They could definitely do such. These chips were likely developed or produced in violation of U.S. export controls. BIS is warning that pursuant to GP10, the use of such PRC advanced computing ICs risk violating U.S. export controls and may subject companies to BIS enforcement action. What are the enforcement actions? Engaging in this without BIS authorization. Again, you have to come to the U.S. even if you're in China. You have to come to the U.S. and ask for what are they called again? The Bureau of Industry and Security's permission to use a Chinese chip, okay? And the only thing you can use it for is benchmark testing and for teardown, deconstruction. If you use this without BIS authorization, it can result in substantial, I'm going to highlight that, substantial criminal and administrative penalties. Substantial criminal penalties. There you have it. And so in this document from China, I don't see that they're threatening criminal penalties. I think that they're just saying that they will expel you from their countries and your assets may be seized or frozen. And then you could be restricted from doing business. I don't even know that this is tit for tat, right? Because they're not threatening to arrest people. They're not threatening to jail people. Meng was placed under house arrest for 3 years, right? So this is the situation that we've come to. Right when Beijing and Washington had a great, both sides reported as a great trade meeting coming out of Switzerland, Washington does this. Why? What is the purpose of this? Who does this benefit? Does it benefit Nvidia? Certainly not. Nvidia just reported that they're going to lose likely $15 billion in revenue from the US government's chip battle with Huawei. Because remember what I said? Nvidia can't sell now into China. They're restricted. So all these customers are going to pick up the CM384. And Jensen is missing out on that market. He already had to write off $5 billion in chips because of Trump's sudden restriction on the H20 series, of which Jensen had a lot of sales for. And so Jensen even mentioned that this is $3 billion in tax revenue lost to the US government. The US government, which is in extreme deficit right now, and saw tepid, I repeat, tepid demand for US Treasury auction. And it jumped up on the 20-year bond market to over 5%, did a nice big jump as they struggled to sell these bonds. How's the government going to be able to finance itself? It's turning down $3 billion in taxes. It's causing Nvidia to lose out on $15 billion in sales in order to do what? To start a fight with China over something that it says is likely true, that it hasn't even proven. At the very least, go out and prove it before you start this kind of stuff. So we see that the CEO from Nvidia said that he felt bad about the H20 chips ban in China, while the US restricted flow of Nvidia H20 processors to Chinese customers that also blocked the path for a US firm to generate revenue from one of the second largest markets. And so think about what this means. If you are Nvidia, you are in a very tough situation now. And the US government, what are they going to say? Are they going to blame China when they started this? Like, it's time to de-escalate. Let me know what you think down below. If you haven't already, please hit like and subscribe. Have a great day.